Hey everybody, thanks so much for tuning in today for my video. Wanted to just chat about a couple things. So it's been a little while since I've done a video. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about some similar things that I've talked about in the past. But today I was reading in First Chronicles chapter 10, and this chapter is about the death of King Saul. And it's drawing mostly from the chronicler, which is a writer that was likely after the exile when Judah had been brought back into Jerusalem. There were writers who had chronicled the entire history of Israel, and so they kind of bring forth all these pieces of scripture that are important to Israel's history. And so King Saul's death here is standing out as a moment of failure in Israel's history. And so when King Saul died, he was basically killed by the Philistine army on the top of a mountain called Gilboa with 3 of his sons. And so that day his entire royal bloodline was wiped out, and so his royal house was killed on that day. So now there's some things that I think I was thinking of when I was reading about this. Mainly what was interesting was that Saul's head was taken by the Philistine army and brought back to Philistia and then put in the temple of their god. And if you remember early on in 1 Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines and brought into the temple of that same temple, and the temple of Dagon was the name of the god, and that idol fell over. This was long before Saul, but the idol fell over and the head fell off. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that Saul's head was brought back to this temple of Dagon, which essentially was a picture of Saul's utter defeat. And I think what happened with Saul's life is a major tragedy. It's truly heartbreaking when you read and study and learn more about it. And if you look at his life was one of constant suspicion and envy and superstition, as well as I believe just the knowledge of good and evil was what he was using to make judgments. He believed in the existence of God, and he basically stood for he was like the religious leader of that time. And so I think in Saul is really meant to be a comparison with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees weren't even existing at the time of Saul. They weren't a thing. But Saul, nevertheless, you can see some correlations between what he was doing and what the Pharisees did, persecuting their rival who God had ultimately chosen, and viewing themselves as the chosen people, and seeing themselves as good, like being aware of their own goodness and not doing things to be seen by God necessarily, but doing things to be seen by other people. And so this was kind of a part of the condition of the Pharisee, which I've talked about in other videos. One thing that you notice with Saul is that he's throughout his story, and I'm a little foggy on remembering all the parts of his story, but what I do remember in the big picture is that he was constantly making these big gestures, these grand gestures of religiosity. And like, for example, the Lord had commanded him to destroy an army and everything in the army, including all of the livestock. But Saul killed a bunch of people, spared the king, and then took the livestock and started sacrificing that livestock to God. thinking that it was honoring him, but it was in fact in direct violation of what God, had told him to do. And so it's like God gives him a commandment, but he takes the commandment and twists it, kind of like Satan does in the garden, and he twists it and he turns it into his own thing and his own gesture of religiosity. And he starts to envision himself as the man God is using, when in fact he's the man that God has left behind and chosen somebody else. And so his death, I think, really happened the way that it's described in the scriptures. Yet God was also, it says in 1 Chronicles, God was the one who put him to death for his continuing disobedience and rebellion, which he likely viewed as maintaining and preserving the religious structure of Israel through his rule, through his royalty. I mean, God, after all, did choose him to become king, but after his initial disobedience, God regretted that decision of making him king, and then chose David. So his death on Mount Gilboa, I think, really happened the way that it's described, yet it also is symbolic for where his heart and his head ultimately was. It was with another God who wasn't the Lord his God. And so it's just a tragedy to see that. And with the Pharisees, I believe there's quite the correlation there when you see what they do to Jesus and the way they envision themselves as the religious authorities of that time, when God had truly taken away their authority and given it to another who was truly the one whom he had chosen to deliver Israel. And they were the ones that saw everything he was teaching, which was that they couldn't do good without him. They couldn't be aware of their own goodness, and goodness only came from the hand of Jesus. And ultimately, on that day of judgment, they would have much to be judged for. This was a teaching that they ultimately rejected as blasphemous, because they envisioned themselves as being fundamentally in union with God, which is, I think, something that Saul himself envisions as well, is that, I have my faults, I have my failures, I'm aware of those things, but fundamentally, I'm in union with God. And that was a mistaken thought about himself. He was fundamentally the man of disunion, which is what essentially the Pharisees are. And the Pharisees, not necessarily just the class of religious elite. It's something, like I've talked about in other videos, that I think dives deeper into the heart of every person, where in some ways we all carry this condition within us. When we are in disunion, we are carrying what we are weighing and evaluating and making judgments on ourselves and other people is based on the knowledge of good and evil, and not knowledge of Christ only and Christ crucified. So that becomes when God calls you and you follow Christ, you're awakened, but in a similar way to when Adam and Eve ate the fruit and their eyes were opened. This was the moment of disunity. But when we're reunited with God through the reconciliation that took place on the cross, our eyes are opened in another sense, and we're called to walk the path of simplicity and truth and a single-minded obedience. And I think that's something that is going to bring us into a total freedom, where, like Jesus says, we're no longer knowing what our right hand is doing. We're no longer doing actions to be seen by men, but we're truly living for the Lord, and we're no longer directed by our knowledge of good and evil, but the will of our Father who's in heaven, and the Spirit of the living Christ who lives inside of us. And before that, we were fundamentally in disunity with God. And so those are just the thoughts that I wanted to leave today, but I'm going to keep it under 10 minutes. So I just I don't know you probably, but love you, care about you. And if you're not a believer, just pray about the things that I've said, and take a look into the scriptures and pray to God to open your eyes to his truth, his reality, and have a blessed day. Thanks, guys.